Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I hope everybody has warmed up sufficiently. Everybody's smiling, so we know the face has warmed up. Excellent. I'm here to give you a brief introduction to our speaker tonight, Germine Awad, who's coming from the psychology department, but who really comes from us first from John Carroll University, where she did her undergraduate work, and then her PhD work from Southern Illinois University, and then did stops at the University of Illinois, the University of Missouri and the University of Texas. And then 4 years ago came here as a university diversity and social transformation professor, stationed in the psychology department, but by courtesy also in the Global Islamic Studies Center and the Women and Gender Studies and Arab and Muslim American Studies units at the University of Michigan. Somewhere in there, I believe I mentioned, yes, I did mention the University of Texas. Her work covers three separate areas: prejudice and discrimination, identity and acculturation, and methods in multicultural work, focusing on American Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African citizens, as well as African Americans. Lately, her work has been expanding to look at identity and acculturation, looking at the study of body image among women of color, while at the same time within the American Psychological Association, taking leadership in advancing strategies to disarm and dismantle racism. She's received the Charles and Shirley Thomas Award for Student Mentorship and Development from Division 45 of the American Psychological Association, and a presidential citation from APA for significant contributions to the field of psychology. I'm going to step aside so we can have significant contributions to our evening and have Dr. Awad tell us a little bit about something on the screen. About the importance of census, race, and ethnicity data, the case of Arab and MENA Americans. Gigi.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Okay, so I am gonna take you on a little journey tonight that's gonna combine some of my research areas, some of my teaching areas, and also some of my advocacy and policy work. And so bear with me as I kind of tell you a story. So before I get down to talking about the census, race and ethnicity data, I want to take a moment to talk to you just basically about what race is. Okay. Here's the thing. We assume that race is a construct that has been around as long as human beings have been around. Okay. But in fact, it's actually a modern idea. It was actually introduced into the English language in the 17th century, meaning the Aztecs were not thinking racially, the ancient Egyptians weren't thinking racially, many indigenous groups were not thinking racially, right? That this was a construct that came up in part as a way to be able to distinguish groups from one another, and its roots were really in colonialism and essentially trying to understand who was liable for enslavement. Okay. So when people started to think about how to categorize human groups, it really came from a place of trying to figure out who can we colonize, who is primitive, right? And then the so-called science of race started to emerge. Okay. Now, here's the thing. Race functions as a social construct, and it doesn't actually have any real biological meaning at all. Now, this is really hard for people to wrap their minds around, because when you look at people from different quote-unquote racial backgrounds, they look phenotypically different. However, that genetic variability that comes out in phenotype is actually quite variable. So much so that there's more variability in physical and biological and genetic characteristics within so-called racial groups than there are between groups. Okay? And so even though it is believed to be a biological construct, it doesn't actually withstand scientific scrutiny as such. Now, to be fair, in my class, The Psychology of Race and Racism, I go over this for 4 weeks, and I'm giving you 4 minutes. Okay, so there's a lot to this, but overall, the conclusion at the end of the 4-week unit is that we just don't have evidence for race as a biological construct, but it is very much real as a social construct. The arbitrariness of racial classifications, for example, is really evident in how the census of the United States changes ethnic and racial labels so frequently. Okay. Now, what is the census? So in the United States, every 10 years, there is a decennial census in which the federal government gathers a bunch of information to be able to count the number of people in the population. So it is a full population count, okay, of everyone. Now, the roots of the census, and I am so sorry, this is not meant to be read, just look at the pretty colors. It is very small, but the different color boxes signify different labels across groups, okay? And I'm gonna go into detail about this on the next slide, so do not even try to read this, I apologize. But in 1790, when the census was started, the very purpose was to distinguish white persons from those who are enslaved or non-free persons. That was the entire purpose of the census. Okay. So at the very core, the purpose was about who do we grant rights to and who do we not grant rights to. And we needed to count those individuals. And remember, we had laws like folks were 3/5 of a person and so on and so forth. We have this history that is well known, right? And so the census helped determine that. Right? So I'm not gonna read through all of these, but I wanted to give you just a taste of how the labels change over time. And these are the actual labels for each decennial census. And I'm gonna, very briefly kind of go through these, just point out some things. But you can see from 1790 to 1840, the emphasis really was about looking at individuals who were enslaved and white persons. That's what was sort of counted in the US Census. And the nomenclature changes from year to year. If you then look at 1850, you start to see new labels for Black folks that were there to signify the amount of Blackness you had in you, okay? So terms like mulatto, which signified someone who was half Black, half white. Terms like quadroon, which is a person who is a 4th Black. And octoroon, which is a person who is an 8th Black. These were actual terms on the US Census, okay? And again, these terms were there to signify who had rights, okay? In 1870, they started to count Chinese folks, and also Indian, which is modern-day indigenous Americans. So from 1900 to 1960, you see the nomenclature is changing. What's really interesting is that there are certain pan-ethnic groups, such as Asian Americans, where you start to see specific ethnicities being actually listed. Now, let me give you a background about why that happens. So I mentioned I do also some advocacy policy type of work. And what I learned, I worked with the US Census for many years, is that the idea or the striving to get a box on the census is really a real estate issue. There's actually individuals who advocate through congressional caucuses to get certain labels to be put on the census form. So for example, the Asian American Caucus did a really great job advocating for having separate ethnicities to be listed on the form. And so it's sort of a real estate grab, right? The form can only have so many things, and there's a lot of advocacy and lobbying that goes into who gets on the form, what specificity is there, and so on, right? Which was really confusing to me as a researcher and a scientist, because that felt very arbitrary, okay? So from 1970 to 2010, the terms keep on. Do we have a decennial census? Well, the purpose is to determine each area's proportional representation in national and local politics and distribute government funding for social services. Okay? And really, as you see, the labels reflect social and political attitudes at the time. But here's the thing that as a psychologist, why I'm interested in census data and who gets to be on the census form. Okay. The reason the census is so important is that it sets the standard for race and ethnicity data collection in virtually every sector of society. So every demographic form you complete is informed in some way by what the US Census deems to be the groups that you need to measure or collect data from. Okay? So if you're not on the census, you don't exist in data. Okay? So my story at the census starts in 2010. Okay? And I'm showing you here this 2010 census form. And it has two questions, an ethnicity question, which is question 8, and then a race question, which is 9. And as you can see, there's check boxes. Like I mentioned before, this is real estate. And then you have some other race category. Right? Now, if you look at these labels, you can clearly see that there are groups missing. Okay. And the focus of my work for many years has been about the ethnic and racialized experience of Arab and MENA Americans. Okay. And as you can see, there is not an Arab or MENA box on the census. Okay. Now, one of the things that happened was that I was starting to study how Arab and MENA folks identify, because it was really weird to me that there was not any representation on these forms of a group that does not consider themselves white. Okay? And so I was asked by someone who worked at the census to actually come to a convening in 2011 to discuss the 2010 census results. And this was based on my work on Arab-MENA identity and discrimination at the time. And so this was the first time I got to go to the US Census. You go through metal detectors, it's a whole thing. They protect that data very well. Okay. And I got to sit in the room and hear from census folks about how they actually go about determining these different labels. Okay? And the reason I was invited is because the 2010 census data collection presented a huge problem. That is, over 1 million folks wrote in an Arab or MENA group in the some other race category. When that happens, that means the form is a failure. You should not have over 1 million people of the same group write in to some other race. So they brought a group of us who studied Arab and MENA folks across different disciplines to think about how to solve this problem, right? To start to think about how the census, if and should the census actually try to have a separate category for Arab MENA folks, okay? And I will just admit, this was my first foray into policy and government. I had no idea what I was doing. I just love to sit in my office and analyze data, okay? I'm a data nerd, I love it, I could do it all the time. But this is the first time I'm in a room with politicians and government workers and listening to what they think about race and ethnicity data collection. Okay. So before I go on with my story, I want to just take a few minutes to talk to you about the Arab and MENA population group. Since at that time, in that convening in 2011, I learned that people don't really know much about this community. We know more now, but it really was kind of a mystery to a lot of folks. So when we think about the MENA region, we're talking about countries that make up the 22 Arab League countries that include Algeria, Bahrain, Comoros, Djibouti, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Oman, Palestine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, the UAE, and Yemen. And MENA was meant to broaden out sort of the term Arab to also include Iran, Turkey, Armenia. And when people talk about the MENA region, there's some countries that are mistakenly put in MENA that are actually not part of MENA, and that is Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay. So, and according to the census, Afghanis and Pakistanis are included under the Pan-Asian categories. And so there is actually a spot on the census form. Okay. Now, I also want to, just as a side note, make sure that I acknowledge that MENA is a colonial term, and folks are not comfortable with it. And one of the things that I sort of mention is that we're working within the system of like the federal government, right? And it isn't really, it's really meant to be a regional term that is recognizable rather than a term that is non-colonial in nature. Frankly, we have a lot of colonial terms that we use. So I just want to acknowledge that it is indeed a colonial term. Now, what do we know about Arab MENA Americans? So I've been doing these kind of presentations for a while. And when I started, these are the type of things people would say. This is what they know. It's Aladdin, the first one. And the new Aladdin, you see Aladdin's up there. In the 2000s, there was a show called 24. It really loved to highlight Muslim and Arab terrorism as the villains. Homeland was another one. Arab, Muslim terrorist villains. There was this great show called American Muslim, but it was so boring because the family was too normal. Okay. Then you have the, should I say, less noble television shows like Shaws of Sunset, right? But this is what people knew. Today, at least we have some change and some movement, okay? We have shows like Rami, which follows an Egyptian Muslim man and really shows the complexity of experiences within these communities, right? It is not one-sided. It is very much, it's a comedy, so it's very irreverent in a lot of ways, but it shows Arab and MENA folks as humans with a lot of layers. Right? Mo is another one that's really great, that follows a Palestinian man who's actually a comedian, but the show also talks about, especially the second season, his experience being Palestinian given everything that is happening, especially pertaining to the genocide. Then you have, again, reality shows like Dubai Bling, again, not super noble. Love is Blind Habibi, which, again, was very fun to watch. And then there's also a film that came out called America that was showing the immigration experience of a mother and son who, again, were coming from Palestine. And so these are more complex portrayals of this community that just weren't around early on. Jack Shaheen and Evelyn Soltani are two scholars that really talked about the bias in the media pertaining to this group. And, and most of the emphasis was really about Arab men being portrayed as brute murderers, terrorists, sleazy rapists, religious fanatics, or oil-rich dimwits and abusers of women. And women were often portrayed as victims or exotic belly dancers. Okay. So we've come a long way, I will say. And I was really happy to put these slides in because we actually have come a long way. So just to talk a little bit about the diversity of Arab and MENA communities, we know that religion tends to play a significant role in the lives of people and communities. Issues such as morality, justice, respect, and privacy are important. Honor, generosity, family reputation, hospitality. And although those are shared cultural characteristics among MENA, there is also a wide level of heterogeneity in terms of religion, culture, economics, and indices of health. Okay. So here's the thing. This group has been fighting for recognition for many, many years. And part of that fight stems from the experiences of racism and discrimination by this community. For example, many folks think that racism and discrimination towards this community started after 9/11. But we actually have evidence that as early as 1930s, people were talking about their discrimination experiences. So as long as Arabs have been in the United States, they've experienced discrimination and racism. But there are some flashpoints in terms of experiences or times when racism and discrimination increases. First time in terms of the age of media was when there was coverage of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. News anchors would refer to Israelis as heroes and Arabs as barbaric. Then you have the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where there was a steep increase in discrimination, racism, hate crimes with this community. Then we have the Muslim ban in 2017. And then, as of last month, there's an expanded travel and immigration ban from all countries that are predominantly Arab and Muslim. And they're not the only ones there. Has over 70 countries included in this. But for example, one of the things that kept on coming up is that we're trying to protect Americans from these terrorists, these foreign, evil folks, right? Well, there are countries in which they're not typically part of this narrative. For example, Egypt, given that there's such a tourist kind of economy. Well, Egypt is they are no longer allowing lottery visa applicants from Egypt either. So it's all countries. So discrimination, unfortunately, has become a common experience for this community. And it's cyclical, right? As these flashpoints in history come up, then these increase, it ebbs and flows, but it's there. Now, because of these experiences, you had many folks trying to fight to get an Arab or MENA box on the census. This fight actually started in the 1980s. Okay. But there was a really significant thing that happened in 1993, in which a congressional subcommittee was tasked with oversight of the U.S. Census, asked for public comment about the existing OMB, which is Office of Management and Budget, Race and Ethnicity Standards. As a side note, the Office of Management and Budget of the federal government is who sets the race and ethnicity data collection standards. It's not the census, actually. Census listens to them. They're the ones who set the standard. Okay? This is something I learned when I was at the census, because I blamed the census for everything, but it wasn't the census. Okay? It was Office of Management and Budget. So what ended up happening in the 90s was that political leaders and scholars submitted proposals for a separate category. And there were two different entities that submitted proposals. The first was the Arab American Institute, and they proposed disaggregating MENA from white and having a general MENA category. And then another entity, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, proposed adding a specific Arab American category. Okay? And so what this congressional subcommittee sort of picked up on is that there's some disagreement on what to call this population. Okay? And at this point, they saw that these two different proposals went through or were submitted, and they said, look, it looks like you all don't know what to call yourselves. Come back when you figure it out. And so there was no category added to the 2000 census. So after learning about this, I decided to do a study. Really basic one. And I want to just talk about how difficult it is to collect data with Arab and MENA folks. So I did not have funding for this study. I was just begging people to fill out a survey, and it took me about 3 years to collect data because there really weren't incentives, and I needed to get enough of a sample size to actually make some meaningful statements. Okay? But I really wanted to ask two questions in particular. One is, would you call yourself an Arab or an Arab American, given what happened with the denial of a category in the 90s? And the other one is, do you consider yourself an ethnic minority in the United States? Okay. Now, I know this is going to be really earth-shattering, so I'll start with the second question. 84% of my sample consider themselves to be an ethnic minority and talked about how white was not the correct category for them. Okay? And the other first question I asked was, is Arab characteristic of you? Would you call yourself an Arab American? And the thing is that this one was more complicated because you have individuals who are part of the MENA group that do not necessarily have Arab ancestry, right? These are the subgroups within other countries. And for many, they didn't feel like it was an accurate label. So this, about 51% were comfortable with an Arab label, which signified that that's not the right category name for a broad kind of racial, ethnic classification. Okay. So one of the things that happened was that after that 2010 census where over 1 million wrote in, the census came back and said, we need to do some research and figure out what to do. First of all, they've already talked about not liking the fact that there was a separate ethnicity and race question, so they wanted to focus on a combined question approach, okay? So this was one of the first iterations of a form they wanted to test for the 2020 census, okay? As you can see here, it just took the existing categories from 2010 and just put a write-in box under. And also included Hispanic and Latino as part of this, and it's combined race and ethnicity. As you can see here, there's no MENA box, okay? Now, this is the kind of fortuitous, lucky things that happen in life. I had a friend who worked as the Arab ancestry expert at the census at the time. And I had just gotten a grant, finally, to look at mental health outcomes with Arab and MENA folks. And one of the things that she told me was that the census doesn't think they have enough evidence to actually test a MENA category on their national content test, okay? So they're like, how do we know if there is a MENA box that people would actually check it? I mean, as a researcher, I'm like, really? Just test it, okay? So what ended up happening was my friend gave me a version of the form that they were considering testing for the 2015 content test. And I decided to use it in my study, okay? So I collected data for this study about 2012, and I replicated the form here, you could see. And I had 3 different versions that I tested based on census. And so what ended up happening was that in my study, I got over 500 Arab MENA folks. And I'm going to tell you something that blows your mind. When there was a MENA box, they checked it. I know, science, right? Okay. So I was asked to come to the census and present this data, okay? Because I had already collected this data. And they're like, oh, really? They checked it? That's great. That actually looks like a form we want to test. I'm like, I know, isn't that amazing? And so because of that and other advocacy efforts, they decided that they were going to test the MENA box in the 2015 National Content Test, okay? And so they tested forms that kind of look like this. This is a phone version just to show you, and you can see that there's a MENA box here. This is one of the earlier forms for the 2015 National Content Test. Okay. So they did this test, 2015. What are the results? I know, this is gonna blow your mind again. When there was no MENA category, people who identified as MENA predominantly reported in the white category. But when there was a MENA category, people who identified as MENA reported in the MENA category. I know, blows your mind. So essentially, the inclusion of a MENA category helps MENA respondents to more accurately report their MENA identities, okay? And they also had differences based on subgroups within the MENA region, which I won't go into here. But essentially, they did $7.8 million worth of research and found out, and this was not just for MENA, they were testing a lot of different things for the census, that these categories are actually working for this community. So as a researcher, I was so elated that research was used to make a policy decision, and it looked like we were about to have a box on the 2020 census, okay? I mean, there were great efforts to get out the count. In 2020, Yalla Count was really big. For 2010, it was actually Check It Right, You Ain't White, was the campaign at that time. And I was just so excited. It's happening. It's gonna happen. And then in 2017, we have a new administration. And that's when the operational deadline for the US Census to be able to add or make changes to the decennial census form, that was the deadline that they gave that you had to make changes by. Well, the administration at the time seemingly stalled and did not make any decisions, and therefore they were even though we had over $7 million worth of research to say that adding these boxes were a good idea, there will be no MENA box on the 2020 census. Okay? So again, this is where politics and research kind of butt heads. Okay? So what happened then? This was the form in 2020. They're like, oh, you all were talking about a MENA box, right? We'll fix it. Maybe they just don't know they're white. So we'll put examples of white groups in the white category. So then they added Lebanese and Egyptian as examples, just so that people were not confused. Okay. So this obviously was a setback. But one thing that did come out of the 2020 census is that for the first time ever, they actually decided to put codes within the white category, meaning for every group that writes down an ethnicity or an ancestry in the census, there's a number attached to it. And they used to not have any numbers for Arab and MENA folks. And then for the 2020 census, they decided to have a code book where they had MENA folks represented. And so we actually got data on those who wrote in any MENA category in either the white category or some other race. So it's something, right? I'm gonna skip this. Well, I will actually not skip this. So 2020 census data comes out. We see that the white population decreases by 8.6%. Multiracial population increased by 9 million, and that's a 276% increase, okay? And all ethnic minority racial populations increased as well, okay? Which, again, was some folks' fear in terms of removing certain groups out of the white category, that the white population is decreasing. In terms of Arab MENA, so this, again, is just about write-ins. Lebanese, Iranian, and Egyptian populations represented nearly half of the 3 1.5 million folks who wrote in on the decennial census, this is a severe undercount, okay? People do not like to write things in. As a survey researcher, I can tell you that. I don't like to write things in, which is bad. I really need to put it out in the world, but I don't. So we know that people don't write things in. They want to check a box. Okay. So here's the thing that is really cool. People in the government change, leadership changes, and they appointed a new head of the Office of Management and Budget, and she came in and she wanted to make some changes to the race and ethnicity categories. Also, she wanted to make some changes in the sexual orientation and gender identity data collection. Okay. And so they proposed these changes to the US Census for 2030. Okay. And as you can see here, the biggest changes are there's a Middle Eastern box and there's a Hispanic Latino box, and race and ethnicities combined. You also have a write-in and check boxes. Okay. And in 2023, March 2023, this was adopted by the Office of Management and Budget. So these are now the race and ethnicity guidelines for the United States. Now that should feel great, we have it, good news. The problem is that the government's really slow in implementing things. Right, and so now it's now we have to wait for the trickle down that happens as folks sort of understand that these are the new guidelines. And the government gives people 6 years to change their data collection methods. Okay. All right, I'm gonna skip around here. So why do we need a checkbox? So what? What is the point? Well, here's the thing. When you don't have a MENA box, it masks disparities between white folks and black folks, white folks and Latinx folks, white folks and indigenous folks, and white folks and Asian folks, right? Lack of recognition is not just a MENA problem. We cannot fix health disparities, educational disparities, workplace disparities, civil liberties, issues, and so on, without actually measuring all of the groups that have kind of differential experiences. Okay? And this lack of a category symbolizes the Arab MENA marginalization and lack of recognition in the United States, which is actually part of, let me go back for a second, a cumulative racial trauma model that my colleagues, Mona Amer and Miriam Kia Keating and I came up with, right? That at macro level, you have issues such as historical trauma, national context, and institutional discrimination, impacting feelings of belonging, freedom and restriction, opportunity and disadvantage at a group level. But at the micro level, you have interpersonal discrimination and identity and recognition issues. So in terms of the census, that really falls into the identity and recognition aspect. Lack of recognition when you're experiencing racism and discrimination has caused a lot of harm in terms of mental and physical health outcomes for this community. So the data that the census collects is important, but it's actually most important because it informs how we collect data in every institution. And we need data to be able to fix problems. And so it'll help us gain a better understanding of community experiences and also allocating government resources and priorities. This is how you get interpreters in hospitals. This is how we protect voting rights. This is how we allocate resources in schools. Right? And so we need national statistics on groups from MENA to assess existing economic, educational, and health disparities so that we can provide solutions. So I'm excited that there is going to be a change, and I did this I created this little graph here of the census race classifications, and I added Arab MENA there at the bottom because its history will start in 2030, but it's been a long time coming to try to get this box. And on that note, if you're interested in Arab MENA psychology, I really suggest you look up AMENA-Psy, which is a national psychological organization dedicated to this community. And also, there's a whole handbook on Arab American psychology if you are interested in other topics. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, any questions? Just raise your hand and I'll come running. Thank you so much, Dr. Awad, for this great presentation. It's right up my research alley. I was reading a paper where they talked about visibility and how visibility can be harmful because it creates the assumption that health inequities no longer exist for populations that become visible. So my question to you is, how can we make sure that we're being diligent to make sure that we're not erasing the fundamental causes of inequities for Arab Americans in the U.S., to just make sure that we're not creating the assumption that they're now this like perfect, healthy population?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't heard that theory. Yeah, I feel like we have so much data that points to disparities that that's the only way we can fix problems, is that when we actually can recognize where they are, right? So I'm a proponent of more data collection, because that's the only way that you can make really sound decisions, especially in terms of allocating resources. This community has suffered for so long because they've been invisible. You know, so there's a common phrase that we use to refer this community, in that this community is both hyper visible in terms of discrimination and racism, and invisible in terms of governmental protections. And so now maybe we can have some of those governmental protections match kind of the hyper visibility experiences. And so I'm gonna say, let's collect that data. It's gonna do more good than harm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I had a quick question about the MENA category. Have you heard about the SWANA category, and how do you feel about that?
I have heard about SWANA. So there is not a SWANA category. So in that isn't necessary, it's not really used on like forms, for example. The reason, I understand the idea that it is not, people want to use it because it's not a colonial term. However, for me personally, it feels like it centers Asian experiences because it's Southwest Asian, North African. And Asians have a space on the census form, and Arab and MENA people do not. And so it's not at all a political reason, that it is only pragmatic and practical for me. I just want to get the data. I actually don't care if you call this group Mickey Mouse. I don't care. I really don't. But I want the data, because we cannot serve our communities and help people if we do not have data. And so, you know, it was really interesting when I was at multiple convenings at the US Census, and one person, I kid you not, this is an actual quote, when they were asking, well, what do you think about the MENA name, right? And I will not name who this was, but someone said, I don't like the term MENA because it's mean. And I was like, please tell me that this is a joke, right? And I'm telling you, this is when you have groups of people advocating for years right? And so we don't want arbitrary reasons to stop forward movement and progress to get this box. There's so much politics involved it's actually infuriating. And I had to learn that landscape, which is not something I personally enjoy. Because it's the truth of the matter is when it comes to these type of issues, you have policy intersecting with research, and they're completely different languages. And so I am always a person that I don't want to get hung up on kind of a principled thing that I 100% understand at the expense of not actually counting this group that really needs, where we really need data to be able to serve the communities.
In your research, did political affiliation and religious affiliation play any part in how people identified themselves?
That's a great question. So in terms of whether or not they saw themselves as an ethnic minority, it did not. So that went across both religious and political affiliations. In terms of sensing or perceiving discrimination experiences, there were differences. For example, there were differences by religious category and also by how acculturated or adjusted to American culture people were, okay? So for example, those who were highly acculturated and also identified as Muslim perceived the most discrimination and racism, whereas those who are highly acculturated and identified as Christian perceived the least amount of discrimination. And so there was this interaction effect just based on adjustment and acclimation to US culture. But in terms of political affiliation, it did not really make a big difference in sort of at least identity as white or not white. Yeah, that's a great question.
Any more questions? Just going down the line here. Thank you so much for your talk. This was very interesting. I'm really excited to see that this category is going to exist in 2030. What do you see as the next frontier if in an ideal world we could collect even better data for MENA groups? What would you like to see in the next decade or two?
Oh, what a lovely question. So one of the things that the Office of Management and Budget sort of said when they made these changes was they changed three things, right? There's streamlined version of race and ethnicity on one form. The second big change is the addition of Latinx and Arab MENA. And the third change that doesn't get talked about is more detailed data at the ethnicity level, okay? So one of the things that they recommend to organizations and institutions is to get as much data within groups across all racial groups as you possibly can, because what we still are not good at is looking at within group disparities, right? Across groups. This is ranging from white groups to black groups, right? That there are differences in experiences and different outcomes within racial and ethnic groups. And that's really what I'm excited to see. I always think we can refine things, we can make things better. Honestly, this is not an end, this is just the start. You saw how many times they change the labels on the census. I have no doubt these labels will change again. But we just need something to start with to sort of move forward. But my dream is that we find a better way, and this probably is going to happen with AI anyway, in terms of being able to code things very quickly when you're collecting large samples of text data, right? That's the problem. So the US Census has all those codes because it is really hard to categorize folks in these in these different categories quickly, and it's millions upon millions upon millions of people. So that is always going to be a challenge, right? Is the mechanism of how we even collect data. And so people are always like looking at this other on the left side there, the you know, minimal categories. They're like, oh, we got it, we did it, we did what the government asked. But that's not a researcher mindset, right? That's a I'm doing what the government told me to do mindset, right?
Hi, I think I have a question, but I also have a comment. You know,
Sure.
I'm not of Middle Eastern descent. I've worked in the Middle East with nonprofits, and that's my background. But I was also a census taker,
Oh,
you know,
okay.
just to make some extra money. And also, having been in grad school before, I you know, and also I was a survey technician here at the university for a while. You just see the importance of data collection. Even I did, you know, as a grad student, as a survey technician, and as a census taker, and I'm working with nonprofits. People don't realize that it's not just for government purposes that data has to be collected and as accurate as possible. You know, to see the change in demographics, like with age, with different racial and ethnic groups, to see what services are needed, but that nonprofits really rely on this data to apply for grants. For instance, like, you know, even a nonprofit you may not think of. One nonprofit I worked with focused on advocacy for people with disabilities. And, you know, when you have changes in age groups, then we can coordinate with, say, the Area Agency on Aging to combine forces, you could say, to apply for grants and funding for various programs that we may share. So my question is also, like, are there agencies from the census or like from academia that work with nonprofits to educate, like especially recent immigrant populations, about the importance of marking these boxes, of being as accurate as possible now that the census, I mean, yeah, it will change a lot. You know, it changed even during the time we were doing the census in 2020. We're looking at because that was the first time they had us use phones instead of paper. And we're just like, WTF, where did this come from? You know, not some of it we were glad about, but, you know, depending on where we were working, like for some reason they put me in the rural areas right on the border with Ohio where people were holding guns to our heads. And they put like the white people, census takers, no offense, in Detroit, you know, and I'm like, what are you trying to achieve here? People are not trusting any of us, especially in that political climate and the pandemic. It just made it hard. But are there like people from the census office or people like you who've worked with academia as well as the census office that are doing outreach with nonprofits to educate, again, especially educate and inform, especially recent immigrants who may actually be very apprehensive about responding, and
Yeah.
with good reason.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So I used to be on the U.S. National Advisory Committee for the U.S. Census for race, ethnicity, and special populations before it was dismantled by the Trump administration. And so one of the things that was part of our charge on that committee was to help the census reach those hard-to-reach populations. And that's exactly what they do. They reach out to nonprofits, they offer training, they educate on privacy concerns. And it's also up to the communities and the nonprofits themselves to educate community members, right? And so it takes multiple institutions and groups to really get at this. This MENA box is new, and our communities are still, you know, they don't really know exactly what to make of it. And so there's still a lot of research. Or to answer also your questions, like how do people even respond to this box on a much larger scale than these kind of national content tests and these, you know, surveys. So there's going to be a lot of education, especially when there's so much surveillance happening right now and ICE is out in full force and people are afraid. And so the census has been contending with this for years. And so they have a whole office just designed at increasing the count what they would, and reaching hard to find and reach populations.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.